Hey everyone, how's it going today? And welcome back to another second stimulus check and second stimulus package unemployment benefits extension update. So in today's update, I want to basically give you guys a little bit of the current status with stimulus check, stimulus package unemployment, but I actually also want to talk about something that is actually very particularly important. And I think that it's because, as most of you guys have probably already know by now, is that the great news is that there is still a lot of optimism in the sense that Nancy Pelosi did actually also show up on the news yesterday and expressed a lot of optimism. But I think it is also fair to say is that as we move on closer to elections, I think that a lot of optimism is starting to really be able to level off. And I think especially true with a lot of different people that are starting to kind of maybe think that the news is a little bit repetitive, or it's like what's going on, all that kind of stuff. And I think that it's maybe very, very difficult, I think, to try to maintain that like hope, especially, and optimism, of course, during such a time, especially trying to balance that between what's actually realistic and then what's just optimism for the sake of optimism, right? So I really just want to address all of that stuff and really about what to really expect in the next couple of days, and really also about what has basically sort of happened in the last couple of basically months this entire time so far. And I think it is going to be a relatively important one. I think especially right now, because I think that because there's so much emotion and so many moving parts and information left and right, I think that a lot of people eventually are going to hit like a break point where they kind of start to act a little bit differently than they know. And again, it's justifiable. Although I will always say one thing though, I do always believe that when you really think about it, a lot of the most successful people in just the world in general have always been the people that have been able to kind of stay composed and calm even when it's very, very difficult to do so. This is especially true in war. It's often the soldier or the guy who's basically able to just stay composed even when it's like, you know, there's so much stuff going on. If they're able to stay focused, that's a skill, and I think not a lot of people are able to do. But with that being said, I think that it's because when there's a lot of emotion that's happening, it's going to cause a lot of people to do things that they normally would not do. Whether this has to do with like crime, or whether this has to do with like starting to put blame fingers at, you know, or saying you said this. And we see it on TV too, even with our politicians, you know, or like I think another thing that I think a lot of people, you know, it's fair to relatively say is just the fact that the news is starting to get a little bit repetitive, you know, but the reality is that that's literally what's on the news. You know, when they're saying everything that they're saying, it just seems like every day now is just like trading punches left and right and all that kind of stuff. But that's really what I really want to address in today's video. And I always tell others is that we can stay conflicted, but it's actually exactly because of this conflict why we don't have a second stimulus check or second stimulus package. Because I really do think is that until we can compromise every single person, whether this is politicians, us, people, everything going on, that's really when we can start to truly see a lot of significant process happen. And I think actually even the stock market is starting to become a reflection, because as most of you guys know, the last 2 weeks before these last couple of days, the stock market was actually going up. So why that's important is because, as we've mentioned, is that the stock market doesn't reflect the economy per se, but it does reflect sentiments. It reflects how people feel or perceive the stock market is going to go in the near, or how the world is going to go in the near future. And I think that as you see the stock market starts to level off, you also kind of start to see how the optimism, I think it's the perfect reflection about how the optimism with everything, whether this is the pandemic, whether this is stimulus, the economy, is starting to level off with it. But as always, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in today's video, but remember to smash the like button if you are here, and consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification button if you are brand new here, and feel free to comment any questions or thoughts about anything at any time at all. So I'm just going to go right into this because I think it is more of an interesting video and topic to talk about. But basically the story is that they are getting closer, and they're even talking today and tomorrow at this time in terms of where they specifically stand. As most of you guys know, 1.9 and 2.2 trillion dollars. There's a couple of touch-ups, but there is actually a little bit more of a deeper reason to why we still don't fully have a second stimulus check and second stimulus package. And I want to talk a little bit about that in a future update, because it is a little bit more of an in-depth story. So definitely smash the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell if you haven't done so already to get future updates on that video. This was literally a clip from Nancy Pelosi literally yesterday, where she literally went on to CNN.
And let's talk about that. You said a few days ago that, quote, we'd have to have our legislation all written by the end of the week to get it passed by Election Day. That was last week. You still have not reached a deal. Is it fair to say that a coronavirus relief package is not going to be signed into law before Election Day? There just isn't the time to do it?
Well, you know, I'll never give up hope. I'm optimistic. We put pen to paper and have been writing the bill based on what we hope will be the outcome, what they said they would get back to us on.
So as you can tell, she does still believe in a level of optimism. But I always say is that I think that even though we're so close, I think that especially given this year, I always tell people is to just hope for the absolute best, but remember to keep your expectations as humble as possible, because I think that this year there's just been so much uncertainty that it's really the only way to kind of protect yourself from just something out of nowhere that kind of happens. And that really has been most of this year. I think that a lot of people have kind of reached their break point exactly because of that reason. And I think that's why I always say is I think that particularly true in this year, it's particularly important to really try to keep things as humble as possible and just be prepared that things can just break all of a sudden. On a bright side is that this has actually been true both for good reasons and for bad reasons. Like, for example, when Trump, remember when he signed his executive orders, how he did say it was relatively promising, and he did deliver. He finally delivered the executive orders, and a lot of people have already received or are basically on the verge of receiving, but most people have thankfully been already received their like 5 to 6 weeks of their like unemployment pay if you are someone that has been here on unemployment. Now, I do also want to address is that if right now the news feels relatively repetitive, which there have actually been a lot of changes actually, in theory actually, like both sides have started to move their numbers, they have reached compromise, each talk, there have been a lot of similarities obviously, but there have actually been differences. Like for example, they changed some of the wording, they worked out some of the part, especially about the pandemic testing, the dollar values, all sorts. But if it does feel a little bit relatively repetitive now, the likely reason is that it's because the politicians have been reporting a lot of relatively repetitive information. And I always say this is I also want to address that a little bit about politics as a whole, because I think a lot of people need to kind of really be able to be aware of this situation. But it's that like if it feels relatively that everything is starting to get very repetitive, it probably means that it's because the politicians are also getting relatively repetitive. And a lot of the news that we really use, whether this is on CNN, whether this is online, YouTube, everywhere else, the reality is that we really can only base the information based on what comes out of their mouth. I think that, like, you know, the information that Pelosi says, that Mnuchin says, that Trump says when he's on his Twitter page, when he's on camera, when he's being interviewed, that's probably as accurate as information as you can probably get. And I think where I'm trying to go is that if we feel that we cannot trust a lot of these politicians, then it probably means that something has to change. And the reality is for a lot of us, we actually voted them in. Now, obviously not everyone. For example, like McConnell has kind of an interesting story where there's a lot of people that don't like him. He has a little bit more of a specific story, but he's actually about to get voted in again. That is the crazy thing. But we'll talk a little bit about that in another video. But I think that it really comes to show why voting in this upcoming election is particularly going to be so more important than ever. But I think the point that I'm really trying to make here is that when it comes to politics or anything right now with stimulus checks, in terms of what to expect, is to try to keep your expectations as low and humble as possible, but of course still stay hopeful for the best. But I think the big reason why is because I think that every single person, if there's any takeaway, is to really understand that the world of politics, there just naturally will be a lot of different moving parts, and it's that we try to use the best resource, which is basically just the politicians, literally what they say. But the reality is, when it comes to the world of politics, we really can only gauge based off of what's on the news, because we don't see what happens behind closed doors. There could be a lot of people that's plotting something behind the scenes. We don't know. So the reality is that most of politics is going to naturally be subjective. And I think it kind of responds to a couple comments, because I've read online before where sometimes people will feel things like, okay, well, this is very opinionated, or, you know, where are the facts, all that kind of stuff. And there are facts to it, you know, like the numbers are facts. The data is facts, what they say is a fact. But I think it's also important in terms of what to expect, basically, is that when you're viewing everything that people say, is to really just be able to make your own gauge about what you believe. And I think that it's because a lot of times you will have some politicians that raise a lot of optimism, some politicians that don't have a lot of optimism. You know, optimism would be like Pelosi's optimistic, Trump is optimistic. Someone that's not as optimistic is McConnell. You know, and I think the key bottom line is that when you're gauging a lot of that stuff, it's really, really important that you kind of really think about what you truly believe in. And I think that while it does sound like, you know, things will be opinionated, the nature of politics, I think everyone has to understand is that politics is opinionated. Most of politics is really being able to listen to people, to kind of have them speak about what they hope to do in the next 4 years, what they plan to change, you know. But the reality is nobody knows the future. So that's why, of course, it has to be opinionated, because it's not about something that has already happened. We don't know what the future is, so we can only speculate based on what they say. And that's the part that I think every single person, when you talk about anything in the world of politics, that's where every single person is really going to vary on their opinion. So I think the big thing is that as we roll into elections, especially with so much uncertainty right now, the big thing is to really just try to keep an open mind, as hard as it might be able to be, and just to realize that if something changes very, very last minute, and this is both for the good and also for the not so good, just be aware. And this is particularly because I know a lot of people have already been asking, like over the like couple of months, right, how this politician said that, or this state said they were going to deposit unemployment on this date, or what happened. And the answer, I think, to really address why this is so important is that with anything, whether this is what has already happened and what's going forward, is to just realize that anything can change very last minute. And I think that's why it's so important to really keep expectations as humble as possible, and to really just be aware is that like things can really change anytime. And that if something ends up becoming wrong, it probably means that the politicians told us wrong. So that's kind of what I wanted to kind of address, to what to really prepare for as we move into elections coming up. So take every single thing that you hear on TV media as kind of just general information, but the big thing is to really just think about it and kind of form your own opinion. That's kind of also why, and it kind of goes back to, I think the bright news is that most of the guesses, at least that I think that I've been making so far, has actually been relatively right on par. But of course, again, sometimes we're wrong, sometimes we're right, sometimes it really depends. For example, like when Donald Trump, remember when he made all sorts of different tweets like 2 weeks ago, which, by the way, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and make sure to smash the like button if you've still made it this far. But remember when Donald Trump made like a whole bunch of different tweets? I remember how he would tweet one thing and then everyone would get very emotional about it, saying, you know, we're not going to do the stimulus until after, then he's going to change it the last minute. And I think that that's something, that's the perfect example about what people really have to understand about the nature of politics, that a lot of it really is just about words, about speculation, about what you think people are going to do. The stock market is the most perfect example. Well, we can talk a little bit about the stock market in another future video. But the people that really make the most amount of money in the stock market are really the people that are able to kind of speculate and guess right for which stock is gonna get really big before it actually gets physically big, before you start to see all of the different news like about Tesla blowing up or Zoom or anything like that. It's about the people that kind of foresighted it beforehand. So kind of how when I heard about Donald Trump, how my personal opinion about it was, I think this was just a pure political stunt. On a brighter news in this case, it was. And that's how we were able to make so much progress to really get to where we're at right now. And again, I think that at the end of the day, we can continue to have conflict, but the big thing to know is that this is the same exact conflict that's been dividing every single thing, and that's been leading to everything that's been going on this year, whether this has to do with like the social justice riots, whether this has to do with the protests, everything that's been going on. And it's only through some level of compromise we can finally reach some level of agreement and peace. And I always say there's this one very popular quote that I don't even know if it's popular. It might have just been something that something told us, but they said something, I remember I once heard somewhere where someone just said something like, when it comes to war, when people go to war, they think they're trying to win when they're trying to fight against the other side. But the reality is, when you look in perspective to where people stand, most of the time when it comes to war, it doesn't end up deciding who's really right in the end. It really just decides who's left. Because when you look around, at the end of the day, damage is done on both sides. And I think that's something to really keep in mind right now. But hopefully this gave you guys a little bit of an idea about what to expect. Hopefully it answered some questions. Hopefully it kind of gave you guys a little bit of information I think what's relatively important about just politics in general, regardless of whether this is before or afterwards. But thank you guys so much for watching. Feel free to comment any questions, thoughts about anything at all. Remember to smash the like button, subscribe, hit the bell if you haven't done so already. And thank you guys so much. Hope to see you guys next time. Thank you guys so much again.